Hey everyone, before we begin the podcast, I have a quick request. 2024 makes 10 years of producing Read My Mind Radio. I'd love to hear from listeners, long-time or new, that have a particular relationship with a specific episode, a topic raised, or the podcast itself. I've received some really cool emails over the years from listeners who shared how this podcast has affected their lives. It would be really cool to hear the voices of the family and share them here on the podcast in some way. If you have a memory or comment to share, or maybe you just want to wish the podcast happy anniversary, please send me an audio memo from your phone or computer. Email it to readmymindradio@gmail.com or call the Read My Mind Radio hotline, 570-798-7343. That's 570-79-T-READ. And leave a message. It would really mean a lot to me, and I think it would make for a cool episode to capture the moment. I appreciate you, family. All right, let's get into it. The clock no longer symbolizes the expiration of time, as in, time's up! It represents the new day. We kicked off the new with SoundScribe, a promising young global majority-led organization from the UK making creative and innovative AD. Today we're headed to Massachusetts, England to Massachusetts, a path traveled before that sort of began something new. Don't worry, this time it's not about conquering, genocide, human bondage, or any of that colonialism. We're moving forward with the idea of a world free of the isms and phobias. If you're joining for the first time, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen to the entire season, but specifically, Time's Up, which provides more context for this episode. I'm Thomas Reed, host and producer of this here podcast. It's time to think differently about access. It's time for an access revolution. Read my mind. Read my mind. The access revolution will be captioned and described. It will include ASL interpretation. It will be free from physical barriers. And in general, it will be a welcoming space for all. Thinking and acting differently about accessibility requires all of us working together.
I'm Sam Gould. I'm an Ashkenazi Jewish woman with salt and pepper hair, 5 feet tall.
Among other things, Sam's the president of Open Door Theater.
Open Door Theater has a 40-year mission of being an accessible theater and a training theater. So we train actors and we train backstage folks and front of the house folks and ASL interpreters, audio describers, captioners. It's a training ground for people.
Sam's also co-founder of Think Outside the Vox.
Along with Christopher
Robinson, African-American male, he, him pronouns. I'd like to say that I'm an aspiring Morgan Freeman, salt and pepper, beard, curly licorice locks on the top.
An ASL interpreter who found his way into performing arts.
In the mid-90s, I was working as a staff American Sign Language interpreter for a very influential deaf executive director. And because I was in proximity to that director, who was a theater performing arts lover and concert lover, I was in proximity to these art spaces. And then I became it. I was the beacon, because where else are you going to find a black male sign language interpreter in the profession? It's really scarce. The last numbers we heard as of 2024 was that 11% of the entire profession of American Sign Language interpreters in the registry, only 11% is African American. And that's 2024, never mind 1995, when nobody's even counting.
Even as a black ASL interpreter, Christopher isn't of the culture.
I was placed in those spaces by well-intentioned white deaf practitioners, white sign language interpreters, to be the interpreter for these black shows that have black content. We approached how to tackle the text of blackness, but I wasn't born and raised by black deaf people, and neither were the white interpreters I was working with or the white sign language coaches that I was working with. So they had nothing to offer. other than just putting me on a soapbox in front of a stage and watching my black hand sign.
We're talking about the importance of representation, authenticity, cultural competency. That, of course, applies to all forms of access.
The accessibility landscape, and especially the AD landscape, was very checking the box. It was very much either non-existent or performed by the old guard of people who had been doing it for years. So we came to the AD party a little late. Our audio description was competent, but it certainly wasn't culturally competent. We started to hear from patrons in the open door space, but also in the community, blind patrons that wanted more.
Then there's the straw that breaks the camel's back. The one thing that seems minor, but it's really the compounding effect. The culmination of many things that just makes you say, "Time's up!" We're talking about access from all perspectives.
Well, what it came down to was there was a theater company that wanted to do, and listen to the sound of my Downton Abbey voice, they wanted to do the right thing and the noble thing, well-intentioned, and get some sign language interpreters on the stage for this show. The reason they wanted them on the stage is because they wanted them to mirror the hearing actors so that any deaf person could go and see the show. So they started doing their development research and they started pricing out, well, how much is it going to be to get sign language interpreters on the stage? And the pricing points that they saw were for the context of legal sign language interpreting work, medical sign language interpreter work in academic spaces, and that does not translate over into the art space.
Based on their estimates, the theater did some serious fundraising to pay sign language interpreters.
Fast forward, through a conversation with me and a couple of other deaf stakeholders that were involved, the development department of this theater company realized that if they do the anti-ableist thing, instead of hiring sign language interpreters, hire deaf actors. Now, what do you think about that? So they, in the effort to be accessible, they were being ableist by not doing what their theater company was designed to do, which is to employ artists, and in this case, deaf artists, to shadow non-deaf artists on the stage. And where they needed the sign language interpreters at was in the production room, in the rehearsal room.
That's access for content creators as well as consumers.
We were hearing from our blind patrons in the theater that they were just grateful to have AD, so they never actually asked for quality AD. They weren't feeling like they were getting the full picture of audio description in the theater when there were such great, diverse, and cultural pieces going on. They were getting perfunctory dance steps, step together, kick, kick, and they weren't getting what the description was of the richness of and the vibrancy of the costuming, actors, characters, all of that. And they weren't getting the sexually explicit content, frankly. They were getting things sanitized to them, and that was making them feel infantilized.
Then there's the perspective of access providers.
With respect to the AD space, we were hearing from a lot of recent trainees and, frankly, a lot of long-term veterans that there's no place for race in audio description.
We're talking about the old guard, the established, quote, AD experts, telling those who want to be inclusive and equitable that there's no place for that. They're still out there. They continue to practice their exclusion, but even worse, they're still training others. Be advised. If your AD training isn't including cultural competency, you may want to go elsewhere.
From the few audio describers of color that we knew that were entering the field or in the field, they were actually being held back and corrected when they tried to put race into the space that was not welcoming race in the space. That was, to us, an aha moment that was like, okay, well, we know how to, from the theater, open doors, but really kick them in and do something about this.
Sam, I would add the ironic tragedy. These colleagues of color were being put in these spaces for shows that have people of color and then stifled, not to mention that there's color on the stage.
Yeah.
Why are you casting me to be in this space only to not mention why you put me in this space? Because there are some very specific choices and intentions on the stage in that space.
Yeah, and also being left at home for the classic shows, which, what? I mean,
Oh,
there's a deficit of audio describers in our region, and the audio describers of color were only being used for the shows that had color in them.
then all the stories that Sam and I were experiencing just started bleeding together. And as they came together, Sam and I were able to see more egregious violations of just out and out racism to colleagues who are doing this access work, ableism, doing this access work. So we needed to respond to the demand, but we also needed to take care of our people.
They began thinking more about the issues, thinking about ways to create a more inclusive space in live theater for their people. Deaf and disabled performers, interpreters, blind AD consultants, disabled consumers. They began thinking outside the box.
I love poetry. I love the abstraction. I live in that space. So this idea is twofold. One is language-based, and the other one's almost tactile, sensory, visual. The language, the notion of vox, or the voice, we kind of think about the Latin and how VOX as a term is used, and voice of the people, or the vox. Well, we want to think outside, not the BOX. We're thinking about the voices that are not represented, the voices that are on the margins, outside of the majority voice.
Okay, everybody, it's tactile time with T. Reed. Take your finger. Come on, go ahead. Take your finger and trace the letter V in the air.
When we think about the letter V, that depression into the valley and then upward movement out of the valley, that architecture of the V, we think a heart monitor. Up, down, up, down. The humanity comes first. You can talk compliance all you want and ramps is all you want, but that's not about the humanity. So we got to think about the human first, the ups and downs of humanity. Where is the human in this work that we're doing?
Now, the letter O.
The O, the O, the O.
Our letter O is not spherical, is not a circle. It is box shaped. We think about, well, what's the frame? What is the frame of the work that the venue or the theater company, the arts company, or the person, what's their frame of reference in terms of accessibility? We start where the person is at. What's their worldview? And then we have a conversation with you beginning there.
And the X.
We think of the word intersection. We think of a literal intersection where all identities, experiences, lived experiences, professional experiences, where they intersect. So we were at that frame box. That's the individual. Now we're talking about the intersection of identities, assets in terms of the business that's an arts organization, and the people within it. How can we create some value that circles back to that letter V to make a better human experience? We know that disability is a part of the spectrum of humanity, all in the arts space. So that's the poetry of Think Outside the Box and what it means to us and how we deploy it.
Think Outside the Box is serving the individual, as in the audience members, the professionals or artists and access providers or ASL interpreters and audio describers, the business, as in the arts organizations, theater companies, or actual theatrical spaces. Doing this effectively often requires additional advocacy, what some might call Accessibility 101 or sensitivity training.
Things that our colleagues are exhausted explaining to every venue again and again. So we wanted to be available when called upon by our deaf, disabled, and blind colleagues to be able to go in and do some of that triage work.
So exactly what does that triage look like?
For ASL spaces and deaf spaces, often there's a lot of email interchange and there's a lot of jargon that theater companies email to sign language interpreters that are contractual and transactional. But when it's working with our deaf artists, they did not orient our deaf artists and our deaf interpreters to working with the theater venues. So our hearing sign language interpreters were more oriented into the business transactions of the space than our deaf peers were. So when our deaf peers did not respond to the company or the venue the way the venue expected, then there was a lot of ableism in language and reply by email that was going toward the deaf people, such as, well, are you sure you're qualified to do this work? How do I know when you're meeting? How do I know that the translation is going to be accurate? These people have lived experience and they're professionals. Look them up on LinkedIn and you'll see that they have more credentials than you. What they have not done is worked with you, and you've provided no onboarding scenario for these colleagues who have expertise and accessibility, but you're providing this orientation and onboarding suite of information and time to all your non-disabled artists, administrators, technicians coming in, but you just want to plug and play the accessibility people as if you're ordering a pizza.
Christopher was clear to note that the deaf artists and interpreters are perfectly capable of advocating for themselves, but he recognizes the additional labor that they shouldn't be responsible for taking on. I find it quite similar to blind professionals who are forced to take on extra work to resolve access issues around completing forms or working with inaccessible software.
And also in the AD space, it looks like a mindset change and cultural shift, because it was sort of revolutionary to include a blind expert on the AD team. It's rudimentary in the ASL space. There's usually a director of artistic sign language when it's being done right. But our colleagues in the theater spaces were not even considering that they needed a blind expert consultant on the team.
I imagine perhaps for some of those unfamiliar with disability, it may be more persuasive to hear from other non-disabled people championing the benefits of hiring disabled professionals as opposed to hearing directly from disabled professionals themselves. This additional work is all extra, uncompensated labor and time that can take a toll on your physical and emotional health.
Then also in the theater spaces, it's very common to have what they call a primary and a secondary describer. So the primary describer is the action boots on the ground in the moment description, and then the secondary describer is doing the pre-show. The disparity in the pay scale in those was significant. It was like a 1/3, 2/3 pay scale versus the workload was not shared more evenly as well. So we're trying to make a more equitable model and, frankly, a better quality model for the AD.
Frankly, that was going on in the ASL space. American Sign Language has so much visibility, and I use that word very specifically, whereas the AD work is literally hidden in the back of the room, in the dark. Nobody knows it's happening unless you're wearing a headset. Whereas the ASL space is literally front and center, but that gives this illusion that there's progressive decision-making, happening in that space. But behind the scenes, the paperwork was just as inequitable, where our deaf colleagues were getting 1/3 or 1/4 of the compensation for showing up doing the same work to assist American Sign Language interpreters like myself who are not deaf to be able to sign accurately. Now, how much sense does that make? If I'm a sign language interpreter with all the credentials of A to Z, I should be proficient in the language. Well, the reality is most sign language interpreters do not come from a native first language, primary language competency in American Sign Language. That's why we're bringing in this deaf, what might be the equivalent of a dialect coach or an ASL coach, to make sure that our language and the translation is aligned with what's on stage. And these folks are getting paid less, and the sign language interpreters who are not deaf were getting courtroom level, medical level compensation in terms of rates, and our deaf colleagues weren't.
And we were just in the Kennedy Center Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disabilities, which is a great space to talk about best practices in arts access. And one of the things that we kept hearing that was really upsetting from some practitioners, access coordinators at large institutions, was one of the ways they save money is by giving their experts free tickets instead of paying them for their expertise.
Starbucks cards.
That makes my blood boil.
Yeah, 2024. Okay. That's the recipe for making real change. Step 1, bring your blood to a boil. Then, add the rest of the ingredients.
I think, Sam, you jumped on that domain name too. Right?
Yeah.
It's not real unless you have a domain.
In addition to that domain, ThinkOutsideTheVox.org became a 501c3 company in order to raise funds to do this work.
So we said we know how to train, and we need to reach out and find the best trainers in the area that we can. We figured if we wanted gig workers, we had to make it easy for them to learn this skill and to fund it for them and get the grant funding for it. And so we got an innovation grant from the Massachusetts Cultural Council.
The training, which weaves in the importance of blind-centered, equitable, and culturally responsive access throughout the syllabus, is just the first step in a very intentional process. You have to find the participants, which is often considered difficult until you think about where to look. And you can't understate the importance of the training being free.
We reached into areas where we figured we would find great describers. Boston Black Writers Association, the Asian American Playwrights Association, actors of color in our region, BIPOC AAPI, etc., blind consumers of audio description, blind artists, and also the local interpreter pool, because we figured that would dovetail nicely into the audio description work. We put together our first cohort of trainees and started there.
The virtual training over multiple weeks was just the first part. A key component is what happens after the training. Members of the cohort were immediately given paid opportunities to write and narrate AD in actual productions with other seasoned professionals, welcoming professionals.
And then when we were able to run the class a second time, we used the first cohort to train the second group because there were already 14 describers up and running and working and picking up a lot of the slack of audio description in Massachusetts because we had a deficit of audio describers to begin with, never mind audio describers who are culturally competent.
What type of impact did this crew of 14 have on that deficit?
With respect to the hard numbers of audio describers of color, prior to our project, there was 1.5 audio describers who were non-white. And I say half because one of the audio describers of color went to do more voice over work and radio work. And frankly, one blind expert in the field. Modestly speaking, we doubled the number of audio describers that were actively working in live theater. We definitely increased the capacity of theaters to be able to offer audio description because there just weren't enough providers to go around.
It actually extends beyond audio description in live theater and naturally includes image description in museums as well. That increase in work opportunities include ASL.
We were working with a handful of interpreters of color for at least 20 different theater performing arts venues and their seasons.
A season equates to an average of 3 to 4 productions in a year. That's somewhere between 60 and 80 individual performances. And then there's the touring performances, traveling an hour to an hour and a half away within the state.
Or they'll cross the line into Rhode Island or Connecticut, and then those same pool of people are being dispatched there. So the visibility, especially for the ASL interpreter and the ASL coach space with this handful, has made those venues who cross-attend other ASL interpreter shows where there are these interpreters of color, then they want to poach and grab those ASL interpreters and bring them to other spaces. Literally, there were a handful of interpreters of color that were actively working in theater performing arts spaces. Now they're closer to 11 that are working in those spaces. That includes individuals who are deaf. Now, generally, people might say, well, that's not staggering. It's less about how many individuals we increased. I think the numbers are in the demand.
The more TOV onboards new theaters, the greater the visibility, which further increases the demand. Meaning, the more people are aware and able to understand and see the benefit of increasing equitable access, the more it's adopted. The benefits include everyone involved.
From our first cohort of culturally competent audio describers, it increased the workload of the local blind expert, quadrupled her work once we started to teach the industry good practices to make sure that they were including a blind professional in the audio description work. That was like life-changing and door-opening for this one individual, but also for all the theaters. One of our actors that was trained, he's a great orator and he's a great writer, but he's got a toddler at home, so he's been struggling to keep the acting work and keep food on the table. And by doing the audio description, it's more finite in time, and he's able to make bills paid with his child at home. And so it really has been instrumental for the gig economy workers in our region.
Many of these gig workers fall into one or more marginalized groups.
There are other colleagues that I'm working with in the sign language space that are able to turn down jobs and turn down offers, not out of arrogance, but turn down offers and turn down jobs because the venue hasn't done their due diligence.
The venues that weren't doing the appropriate onboarding or paying equitably. Today, with workers having more welcoming opportunities, they can now say, "Time's up! We're not working with you until you fix this and show us the respect we deserve."
It's been a wake-up call. People come back and say, "Hey, Chris, Sam, can you help us find this person or that person because these other ones flat out turned us down?" And we're able to ask, well, why? It's a different kind of conversation than what it used to be, which was just a lot of our peers calling us and saying, "Hey, man, they're causing us damage, they're causing us trauma." I think the scales have tipped in the other direction, which is a wonderful problem to have.
For those who don't necessarily appreciate the anecdotal, TOV is collecting quantitative metrics as well.
Certainly with Open Door Theater, we can take in exactly the metrics of who's coming to the performances for what access service, but we're also starting to get and collect that information from other theaters, the patrons who are attending the performances, what worked, what didn't work. And we're also getting the information from our cohorts of audio describers as to what jobs they're taking, what jobs they're doing, and the feedback that they're getting directly from the patrons in the space.
Keeping focus on the humanity in access continues to guide Sam and Christopher into their future plans for TOV.
When you're an access provider who is plugged in, brought into content that's very specific to the lived experience of the provider, whether it's a August Wilson piece or Baldwin Black-centric or BIPOC-centric, well, you're getting saturated in that journey. A lot of it is trauma-ridden. Some of the future things that Vox is considering is how do we create respite space and an information resource repository for sustaining our access providers that are exponentially more exposed to trauma proximity because of the content that they're working on and the frequency they're working on. So some kind of sustainability, resilience, mental health support and resource for our gig workers who are doing the work that is in our future.
We're trying really hard to not be global, national too fast because of capacity and burnout. We're trying to make sure that we are sustainable in what we're doing and creating a model and a blueprint and then work on helping other people distribute that elsewhere.
In addition to more culturally equitable AD trainings, TOV has plans to assist artists to engage with legislators to assure their needs are properly being met in government.
We're working on an exciting project with the local Arts Boston calendar, and they are putting out a calendar that is accessible and sortable by access point, which we've needed in the sector so badly, so that when you want to go see a show that's interpreted in sign language or audio described, you can sort by that access point, and then the audio description pre-show is like loaded right into that website, and the ASL vlog is loaded right into that website, and you can see who the providers are because you might be a fan of a certain audio describer or director of artistic sign language. Every city should have one of those.
Every city should have a Sam Gould and Christopher Robinson. And think outside the Vox. You know, Sam, Christopher, when I invite folks in and they come in and they share their information and they do all of that stuff here with me, with the family, not just here with me, but with the family. And so it means that you, Sam, Christopher, are now, you always been, but you are now official members of the Read My Mind Radio family.
I've been waiting for you to make it official for years now, Thomas, so I'm super honored.
I know there are some listening who are either in position or proximity to those who want to make their local theater space much more accessible and do so equitably. Listen back to this episode or read the transcript. Then reach out to TOV. You can find contact information and more about them as TOV and individually at thinkoutsidethevox.org. We can all head on over to opendoortheater.org and learn more about their work and accessible productions.
The next production that the theater is going to do is The Prom. It's a fun show. It's got a mission of inclusion, but it's also got a mission of self-advocacy and don't foist your agenda or your accommodations on me. So that's the one we're looking forward to doing now.
Sometimes it feels like everything is a fight. Right now, we're in the midst of fighting for a so-called democracy here in the U.S. I just want to once again encourage everyone in the states to please exercise your right to vote. I can't tell you who to vote for, but if you're listening to this podcast, I hope that means you have both a high level of empathy and intelligence. You care about your fellow human. That combination can really only go one way. You may not think your specific issues are being addressed by either candidate, but I can tell you that one candidate will ultimately mean your issues will never even be heard. The other candidate will at the very least assure you have the right to protest her. It's your choice. Unfortunately, I have to choose to conclude this season of flipping the script on audio description. I had a good time producing it, and I hope you enjoyed listening and or reading it.
Shout out to those who read the transcripts.
I may have 1 or 2 episodes later this year, so stay tuned and subscribed. I'd love to put together a celebration of a 10-year episode, so please, if you feel any sort of way about the podcast or just want to give a shout out, please, as requested in the beginning of this episode, send it in. I appreciate you all rocking with Read My Mind Radio, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. Transcripts and more over at readmymind.com. You know, it's been determined by a landslide that the only way to get there is to make sure you spell it right. That's R to the E. I.
D, and that's me in the place to be.
Like my last name. Peace.